ahead and start in anticipation of the talk, and I'm so pleased to see so many people here before 3 o'clock. My name is Susan Crane. I'm a faculty member in the Department of History, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Sally and Ralph Duchamp Campus Lecture Series presentation. Just to start with a few words of appreciation, I wanted to thank the Duchamp family for their generous support of this lecture series, which is an ongoing event during the year. We also owe thanks to Judaic Studies and the Department of German Studies, the Department of History, as well as the Honors College for sponsoring today's lecture. So thank you to all of these entities. By way of introduction, this almost seems like the subject that needs no introduction. You're all here already knowing who is the subject of today's lecture. Even well before the end of World War II, Adolf Hitler was already the subject and the object of what I think of as a repulsed fascination, and it's been experienced around the globe ever since. In fact, it's been so persistent that Hitler's charismatic appeal is often cited fearfully by those who are worried about the temptations of a resurgent Nazism. In the post-war German states, Hitler's Mein Kampf has been unavailable for sale until just now, just this year. His early artwork has been withheld from public view, and there was a taboo against representing him in film until very recently. Until a few years ago, no German actor had ever portrayed him on film. So we take all of these as indications of an ongoing concern, and yet at the same time an ongoing fascination. Decades after the war, Sir Ian Kershaw produced a definitive biography in 2 volumes, but it seems that a lurid interest in the dictator has never actually died out. So while curiosity and speculation are rampant on the internet, and if you Google just Hitler, you'll get over 100 million results. There have not been as many serious scholars who were willing to tackle the persistent public interest in everything to do with Adolf Hitler. I too might have been nervous about having someone give a talk on this subject, much less about advertising it to the public, if it hadn't been proposed by Harold Marcuse. Dr. Marcuse, our guest today, has taught history at the University of California at Santa Barbara since 1992, and he's written extensively, and I've benefited from his work, on Holocaust memorials and how Germans have come to terms with the legacies of responsibility and shame. I also find it intriguing, however, that he began his academic career with a bachelor's degree in physics from Wesleyan University. It's an unusual path for a historian. I also want to mention this as a heads up to my students who are here in the audience today. There are many winding paths to travel after graduation. Just because you majored in something doesn't mean it's what you're going to do with the rest of your life. In the early 1980s, Dr. Marcuse traveled to West Germany and studied Holocaust memorials as a master's student at 3 different German universities, at Munich, Freiburg, and Hamburg. So this is another note to the students. Study abroad is really good. Way to expand your mind. And I also know we have some British and I think German exchange students with us in the audience today, so they already know this. Returning to the United States to work on his PhD at the University of Michigan, Dr. Marcuse focused his research on Dachau concentration camp, both during and after the Nazi regime. The resulting prize-winning book is Legacies of Dachau, The Uses and Abuses of a Concentration Camp, 1933 to 2001. Dr. Marcuse is also very much involved in managing the legacy of his grandfather's work, that is the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, by making information about his family and Herbert's work available to the public. He joins us today for what I understand is the inaugural presentation of this new research project about the sources of myths and facts about Hitler. So I hope you will please join me in welcoming Dr. Harold Marcuse.
Thank you, Susan, for the kind introduction. As Susan said, indeed, this is the first time I'm actually speaking publicly about Hitler, although I've been working on following the research for over a decade now. I got started, physics actually played a role because I post my course materials on the internet, and I sometimes look at the web stats, so historians don't always feel comfortable with the technology. And I found that my Hitler page was one of the few done by an academic who put any materials whatsoever on the web, although of these 100 million sites, a lot of them are neo-Nazi. There's a Hitler museum that has lots of materials. And a colleague of mine, Randall Beitwerk, communications professor who has the German propaganda archive on the internet, a great resource for students, emailed me one day and said, you know, they're saying this stuff about Hitler. You're the only one who has a page of any, scholarly imprimatur. Can't you counteract this? And so I started looking into it and really researching Hitler in much more depth myself. And I was sort of stripping away the sources, the kind of palimpsest, and you scrape it down and you find another layer underneath and you scrape it and you slowly get down to what do we actually know about Hitler and the common misconceptions. So just as one example, I chose this image as when Susan asked me for something graphic to help talk about the talk. There are two reasons. One is the globe, and the other is Mein Kampf as the source of Hitler's ideology. The aide to Hitler says, heavens, are you serious that what you say in Mein Kampf, that we're actually going to do this? It's a 1935 caricature that when people started taking Hitler seriously, although the book was a decade old. You see the globe. I'm sure many of you, how many people have seen The Great Dictator? You remember that? Many, so maybe half the audience. There's a globe in the Reich Chancellery where Hitler, when he conducted business in a regular way in Berlin, there was also one of these globes in the so-called Eagle's Nest in the Alps south of Munich. It was a limited edition globe for the, what was it called? I should have written down. The Columbia Globe for merchants and industrialists who wanted to sort of span the globe, a kind of imperial thing. Hitler wasn't particularly attached to it, perhaps, but this globe actually resurfaced after the war. A private in the U.S. Army found the one in Berchtesgaden and somehow got it back to the U.S. And when he died, the people who inherited his goods, it was auctioned off in San Francisco in 2007 for $100,000. The original price was a very expensive object. It was about the equivalent of $20,000. So we have this artifact that people knew about already in the 1930s that is still bouncing around, so to speak, today. So what I'm going to do is present Hitler's biography to you, and while I'm doing it, I'm going to get into some of the issues, some of the legends that persist about him, and I'll be sure to end on time, a little before 4 o'clock, so that we'll have plenty of time to talk, and I'll address your questions. There's so much detail and so many of these different myths that I've written it out carefully so that I can keep to the time fairly well. So I'll start with some of the research that was done about Hitler. As Susan said, there have been shelves upon shelves of books written about Adolf Hitler. His biography is one of the most carefully researched of any major political figure during any period of history. Not only have amateur and professional researchers combed publications and archives for any possible relevant documents, but they've interviewed people who came into contact with Hitler. They ferreted out every last document that was available. The oral and written statements made by those people have been subjected to careful scrutiny. And even today, even in the most recent decade, even in the past few years, new documents have been turned out. There have been DNA tests on relatives of Hitler done that I'll talk about in the course of the talk. And at the same time, the historians are doing this scholarly track of trying to find out what can we really know about Hitler. Many ideas about him and his life persist in the popular imagination. They appear and reappear in documentary films, in dramas, in works of fact and fiction. They stubbornly resist debunking, even after having been thoroughly disproved. An adage about memorials, which I've studied in depth, applies here too. The scanter the remains, the wider the range of possible interpretations. And one reason Hitler's biography isn't well documented for periods is because he wanted to control it. So he actually consciously destroyed documents, and he also created forgeries to document some things that weren't true. So scholars have had to figure out which those are. So as far as the new sources go, for example, in 2005, a diary, so-called diary in the publications, it's really a memoir, was written by his 7-year younger sister, Paula. She recounts in greater detail their early childhood at home, which I'll spend some time on in this talk, both before and after their 65-year-old father died. She was 7 years old at the time, and Adolf was 15 when their father died. This document confirms in greater detail some of the things Paula told U.S. Army investigators already in July 1945 and June 1946, when they interrogated her where she was living in a hotel near Hitler's Eagle's Nest, the Berghof, in the German Alps. Those interrogations, by the way, as many Hitler sources, have been published on the internet, in this case by a more reputable website, the Nizhkor Project, Holocaust Memorial Project. In that same year, 2005, the same historians found the manuscript of an additional memoir, so-called memoir, jointly penned by Hitler's other two siblings, his 7-year-old half-brother Alois Jr. and his 6-year-older half-sister Angela. So he's got a 7-year younger and then two roughly 7-year-older siblings. They were children of their father's previous marriage. While these yet unpublished documents don't seem to add anything new to our previous knowledge about Hitler, assuming they're genuine, they do add some detail and confidence to previous interpretations. And I say assuming they're genuine because a lot of things seem to pop up about Hitler and then turn out, like the Hitler diaries in the 1980s, to have been forgeries. There was an East German forger who was just a wonderful handwriting expert, and he created a number of sources that have crept their way into the documentary record, even into publications that have later turned out to be utterly false and figments of his imagination. However, some recent scholarly works are of particular note because they definitely do change and advance our understanding, or potential understanding, of who Hitler was and how his biography played into what he did and why he did it. I'm going to mention briefly the 10 or so that I think are most important. So you don't have to worry, I'm not going to cover or discuss all of them in detail. This will give you an idea of how scholarship about Hitler keeps on delving deeper and coming up with new results, debunking assumptions based on false or misleading claims made by Hitler himself or by his supporters and enemies who knew him during his lifetime. So let's see, where's my, what did I do with it? I'll just use the keyboard. So recent scholarship. Two of the very best and most readable books, oh, you put it down here, thank you. Combine impressive sleuthing with great readability. These are Brigitte Hamann's, there we go. They're by the Austrian historian Brigitte Hamann. Her 1996 book about Hitler's time in Vienna and her 2008 book, Hitler's Edeljude, Hitler's Special Jew, about the Jewish doctor Edward Bloch, who treated Hitler's mother for breast cancer in 1907. Next are the 1997 and 1998 books by Hungarian-American scholar what's his name? John Lukács and U.S. journalist Ron Rosenbaum. They both look at the historiography of Hitler in a similar way that I am, but they're looking at the historians and how they've attempted different explanations of Hitler over the decades since the 1950s, when the first ones were published. Actually, they go back to the 1930s when the very first biographies of Hitler were published, right up to the present day. Lukács works more with the books, and Rosenbaum went around and actually talked to the still living historians and asked them for a total for their sort of summation of after all of their research on the topic. Then there's Ian Kershaw's massive 2-volume biography, the definitive biography still that Dr. Crane mentioned earlier. He summed up and critically examined the research up to that point. He's the most recent in a line of exceptional biographers who wrote 1,000-page tomes about Hitler. They include Alan Bullock in 1952 and John Tolland and Joachim Fest, an American and German scholar, in the 1970s. Soon after the publication of Kershaw's book, German historian Lothar Machtan wrote a book examining Hitler's sexuality, in particular the evidence that he may have been bi or homosexual. Machtan lays out how that might explain quite a few odd aspects of Hitler's political career and some strange relationships. But he does not relate that to how Hitler came to be such a virulent hater of Jews. Some historians reject Machtan's evidence out of hand, but I personally find it rather convincing. Many, let me say, queer aspects of Hitler's life make much more sense when viewed in that light, although it does nothing to explain his genocidal hatred. Two other somewhat controversial books were written by British neuropsychologist David Lewis and a German historical novelist Bernhard Horstmann about Hitler's recovery from blindness in the Pasewalk military sanatorium in the closing days of World War I. Dismissed by some as psychobabble based on scant direct evidence, I think it may actually point to a key event in Hitler's life, a psychotic break. I'll say more about that in a little bit. Most notably, and a lot of what I'll present to you today is drawn from this, is the 2010 study by British historian Thomas Weber about Hitler's World War I regiment. He went into the military records, tracked down name by name the men who fought with Hitler in that regiment, who survived the war, looked at their denazification files, their German military records, did statistical analyses of them, and just went over them with a fine-tooth comb and came, I think this is probably the most definitive work that has recently come out about Hitler. And there are others as well that I won't say much about in this talk. In 2005, Anne-Marie Siegmund wrote a book about Emil Maurice, a very colorful figure who was Hitler's confidant and chauffeur from the early days into the 1930s. He was the one who in Landsberg prison began the typescript of Mein Kampf, which Hitler dictated and later to Rudolf Hess. They were both serving time for their role for their participation in the Munich Putsch in 1923. Another very important scholar is Timothy Ryback. He's an investigative journalist, writes for The New Yorker. He's now head of the Hitler Research Center in Berchtesgaden in Hitler's mountain retreat, the former Berghof, south of Munich. He's the discoverer of the aforementioned diary memoirs, and he published a book about Hitler's private library. He went to the Library of Congress, so the books in the Berghof and the Chancellery and Hitler's Munich residence were confiscated by the U.S. Army. Some shipped to the Library of Congress, some have ended up at Brown University. He went through all those books and looked at the ones that had marginal notes, the ones that were well thumbed, and wrote a book about what that tells us about Hitler's thought and where it may have came from. So he's a very important scholar. This research forms the basis of what I'll talk about today. To start, I'm going to make sure we're all up to speed on Hitler's biography itself, I'm going to start with, let me intersperse a little bit about the sources of Hitler's biography. This was a newspaper article that came out on Hitler's birthday, April 20th of 1924. Hitler had just been sentenced to Landsberg prison for high treason, for trying to take over first the Bavarian and then planning to march on Berlin and take over the Berlin government. And this local paper, the Innwacht, the Wacht am Rhein is a famous German patriotic song, the Watch on the Inn River, gives a little bit of biography of Hitler before he wrote Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is and was the main source of what we know about Hitler's biography until his death. So journalists had tried to dig up more, but they couldn't really get access to his sister or his siblings, although they did. The siblings did say a little bit about him. They weren't really free to talk about Hitler until after the war. So Mein Kampf is very important. And then there's a November 1921 letter that Hitler wrote to the leader of the Austrian German National Socialist Workers' Party. So the German acronym has the D over here, but the Austrians wanted to unite wanted to have a National Socialist movement as well. It started out anti-Czech and then became anti-Semitic. And Hitler was basically giving this Austrian compatriot his own biography to sort of establish his chops as the new leader of the German National Socialists. So there's some earlier ones. This letter corresponds mostly to what Hitler later said in Mein Kampf. And all the journalists who started writing about Hitler in the 1920s could draw mostly on these sources, and then they'd go back to his hometown or to find people who knew him in those days. And those people were mostly influenced by these writings as well and sort of tried to embellish upon them. So the myths really got implanted very early. Wrong one. And I better go back here. So there are several deliberate distortions in the autobiography. One that I'll be talking about at length at the end of the talk is his relationship to his father, of what his family life at home and how that may have played to his behavior later in life. There's been a lot of, as I said before, psychobabble or psychoanalytic interpretations of what happened. But three of the more important ones are Hitler telling about his poverty and how hard he worked in his years in Vienna when he was roughly 18 into his early 20s. And he dates the formation of his worldview, especially his view of Jews and why they are such bad people to that period. And then the date of his move from Vienna to Munich, which is the age of majority, sort of our voting age of 18, back then was 24 in the Austrian Empire. And that was the age when you could be drafted into the army. It was also the age when any trust fund or inheritance could be given to you straight out. So it was an important date, and he sort of predated his move. As we'll see, that's important. Once he became Chancellor of Germany, he had a crack team of researchers go out and try to get a hold of every possible source about him. And some of those were destroyed. When he invaded Austria in 1938, they immediately went into the Austrian archives and tried to gather up all available evidence and collect it into what's known as the Hauptarchiv, the main archive of the NSDAP. And as I said, there are a number of forgeries in that collection that date back to the period of the early 1930s. Okay, so this is just one text from Mein Kampf where Hitler describes how he became an anti-Semite, and I will read it to you. In this time of bitter wrestling between educating my soul and cold rationality, the Vienna streets did me an invaluable service by giving me a concrete lesson. The day arrived when I wasn't wandering the streets of the mighty city overwhelmed anymore, and I took in not only the buildings, but also the people. Once while I was walking through the city, I suddenly encountered an apparition in a long black robe with black hair curls. Is this a Jew? Was my first thought. They hadn't looked like that in Linz. I covertly and cautiously observed the man, and then he sort of goes and there's this strange other, and he then goes on to say all the evil things that Jews have done. So this is his writing in 1924 while he's in prison. So we'll see whether that's true and what evidence there is pro and con as I try to date his anti-Semitism. So he dates it already to his earliest encounter with Jews in Vienna in 1908. So I'm going to start with Hitler's birth in 1889 in a town on the Inn River in Austria, where his somewhat elderly father worked for the Austrian Customs Department. Adolf's mother, his father's third wife, was 28 when she gave birth to him, 13 years younger than her husband. She was already raising two children from his second marriage, who were 7 and 5 years old when Adolf was born. When Adolf was 2, the father was promoted, and the family moved to Passau in Germany for 3 years. Then his father was promoted again, so his father worked on the German side of the border. There was a new customs treaty between Germany and Austria at that time. Then his father was promoted again. The Hitlers then moved to Linz, or rather to a nearby village, then to a suburb in the following years. The father retired in 1895 and died in 1903. At that time, the family moved closer into the town of Linz, which had a population of about 60,000. So it was a big step up from what Hitler had previously experienced. The father died in 1903. Hitler was a good student in primary school, but he was rather poor in what they call the Unterrealschule. The lower sort of middle school would be the American equivalent. After squeaking through his 9th grade exams at age 16, he was given his completion certificate on the condition that he not come back to that same school. With his father dead the year before, his indulgent mother let him spend the next 2 years hanging out at home in Linz, where he and his best friend Gustl Kubizek liked to go to the theater. Kubizek's memoir, by the way, is a key source about this period of Hitler's life and family, and also a problematic one. More on that later, too. In the summer of 1907, at age 18, Adolf went to Vienna to apply to the Art Academy, but he failed the entrance exam. The examiners were, by the way, not Jewish. That's a common mythic conception that is invoked to explain his anti-Semitism. Hitler came home to care for his mother in October of 1907. Since January, she had been suffering from breast cancer. She had had a lumpectomy in February, recommended by this doctor, Edward Bloch, but sent to a different surgeon, so Bloch didn't perform the surgery himself. By September, Bloch was making regular pro bono and eagerly awaited house calls to change Clara Hitler's bandages and to give her morphine. How do we know this? Bloch's account books with their daily logs have survived, collected by the Gestapo before Bloch was allowed to emigrate from now annexed Austria in 1940, and preserved in the German National Archives, along with other materials from this Nazi Party main archive collection. Clara died in December with a distraught Adolf by her side. Paula, age 11, was there too, but Alois Jr., his stepbrother, had left home 11 years earlier, and his half-sister Angela had gotten married 4 years prior, shortly after their father died. After very maturely and competently arranging the family matters, Hitler returned to Vienna in February of 1908, this time with his friend Gustl Kubizek. They rented a tiny room together. By September, they had a falling out. Adolf tried again to get into the Art Academy and failed a second time. And Kubizek succeeded in getting into the Music Academy. He later became a piano teacher and married, had children, and actually got back together with Hitler, was invited to the Wagner Festspiele, the Wagner festival in Bayreuth. So there's some documents about, I'm getting ahead of myself, I think I am, about Adolf's next 5 years in Vienna, such as registration forms and a squabble over a broken contract to paint a portrait, which made it to the courts. There's also some testimony by acquaintances. For instance, another drifter who worked with him selling pictures of famous Viennese attractions. During this time, Adolf had a small income from his orphan's pension. It is very unlikely that he worked construction, as he later wrote in Mein Kampf and claimed in campaign speeches to German workers. Many friendly biographers of the early 1930s repeated this claim again and again in different variations, that he had worked clearing away debris, that he had painted houses. So there's a number of kind of embellishments and rumors as witnesses kind of had read Mein Kampf and tried to give their own spin on what he was doing. There's no doubt that during this time Adolf Hitler came into contact with an anti-Semitic milieu in the city of Vienna. He likely heard the racist diatribes by the popular and charismatic Mayor Lueger, who was in office for 13 years from 1897 until 1910 and was publicly in his speeches quite anti-Semitic. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote that the proverbial scales fell from his eyes in that passage that I read to you earlier. That may be correct, but I think the evidence indicates that any anti-Semitism he developed at that time was little more than stereotypes and prejudice. After a 1912 visit to Munich, in May 1913, 24-year-old Adolf moved to live in Munich permanently, leaving no forwarding address. As I said before, 24 was the age of majority, so he was finally able to access a lump sum inheritance. And one other thing that he doesn't say, he went to Munich with a friend, Rudolf Häusler, and they rented a room together, a very small attic flat with the Popp family, P-O-P-P, in Bohemian Schwabing. And Schwabing is sort of the Greenwich Village or the Haight-Ashbury of its day. It's a very liberal, alternative milieu in Munich. The Popps are a very important source for this period, albeit tainted, since they were interviewed after Hitler was already in power decades later. They also preserved several letters he wrote home to them from the front early during World War I. So he had really broken from his family, and he didn't really have anyone else to write to at that time, so there were some cards from them. But by the time they were interviewed in the late 30s, Hitler was already a major political figure, and you didn't want to cross him. The Nazis had their street brawling reputation. Very important event in this period. In February 1914, the Austrian officials tracked Adolf down and served him with an arrest warrant for draft evasion. The military authorities had to go to great effort to track him down. Adolf wrote an explanatory plea, then went to Salzburg, where he got a medical deferment, kind of proverbial flat feet deferment from the army, so he didn't actually serve time in prison, and he escaped by the skin of his teeth and was never actually arrested for draft evasion. A few months later, in August 1914, however, 25-year-old Adolf cheered the outbreak of the Great War at the Feldherrenhalle in Munich. Has anyone seen the famous picture of a crowd? Not many, with a little blow-up bubble. Let's see. There it is. So this picture was found by, let me see if I, the picture has its own story. Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, described in a 1950s memoir how he and Adolf had been talking about that day the war broke out and discovered that they had both been on the square at the same time. Hoffmann searched in his archive for the glass plate negatives. They pored over them together and discovered Adolf in one of them. By the way, there's also video film footage of this same scene, and one sees a streetcar passing through the crowd, and one can recognize someone who is probably Adolf in the background. So it's probably not a forgery, although that has also been noted by one of the recent historians, that the original glass plate of this photo is missing, although all the others from the series are available, so that Hoffmann might have destroyed it to remove evidence of a forgery. I wanted to throw in a map while I've got images going before I go back to the timeline, just that you can see where Hitler was born. So this is Braunau on the Inn River. Then the family moved to Passau when he was 2. The father worked actually on the German side in customs enforcement. And then this is Linz, where first the father loved beekeeping. That was his hobby. He was already passionate about it in the 20 years he spent in Braunau. He wanted to farm. He was from a farming family, had brought himself up. We'll go into that in much greater detail later. So from Linz, Hitler himself goes to Vienna, and then from Vienna to Munich. And up here is the so-called Waldviertel, the forest quarter of Austria, a very rural district where Alois, his father, had been born, and where his ancestors and most of his family lived, and he had spent vacations with his aunt at times, for instance. So that's his homeland, and after Hitler came to power, it was turned into, or in the late 1930s, after he invaded and annexed Austria, it was turned into a military testing ground. And so his ancestral villages were bombed to smithereens, also invoked by psychoanalytic interpretations of Hitler's efforts to destroy any evidence of his roots and his dislike of his origins. So back to the timeline. He volunteers for the Austrian Army. He's a little older than your usual draftee at 25. And as an Austrian citizen, Austria and Germany were two completely separate countries, he had to petition for permission to fight in the Bavarian army. And although Bavaria was part of the Reich, it still had its, if we think of Texas and its Lone Star State separatist tendencies, Bavaria was kind of played the same role in the German Empire and had its own army that was subordinate to the Reich army, but had its own commanders and regiments. After a brief training in September, the regiment went by train to Flanders in October. Adolf's regiment was decimated in the first weeks of the war. In what came to be known as the Kindermord at Ypres, only 17% were still alive after 20 days. 611 men of the original 3,600. So 3,000 had been killed in the first 3 weeks. And one of them was its commander List, so it became known after him as the List Regiment. By December, in Hitler's own company, only 42 of 250 were still alive. At that time, Adolf himself was promoted from private to private first class. He was awarded the Iron Cross second class and appointed to be a dispatch runner at headquarters. For the rest of the war, he lived in relative comfort, well behind the front, not in the horrific trenches that were often bombed for days on end. For the rest of the war, he lived in relative comfort, well behind the front, not in the trenches. And that's where, by the way, most of the biographical scenes in movies depict him. There's usually a brief scene about his World War I service, and you see him in the trench with the thudding artillery shells falling all around him. So another perpetuation of the myth that he was in frontline combat, which he nurtured greatly. Over the next 4 years, Hitler delivered messages to the front lines in 47 major engagements that could be very dangerous and required bravery, but of a different nature than conquering the fear of going over the top and charging enemy lines with bayonets. Adolf was injured in October 1915. A shell exploded near the entrance to the dispatch runner's dugout, and a piece of shrapnel lodged in his left thigh. Two of his best friends were wounded, or fellow dispatch runners, one of whom was his best friend, was wounded at the same time. He was sent to a hospital near Berlin, recuperated for 2 months, and then was sent to Munich, where the List Regiment's reserve was, and remained there for 3 months. And we have sources from this period, including a letter that he wrote where he said, "It's awful here in Munich. I hate it. The food is bad. I have a constant stomach ache from the coarse bread." And he said, everywhere in the guys who are at the front, there are Jewish clerks everywhere who are malingerers who should be serving at the front. So we have some evidence that he had prejudice against Jews at this time, although the German army did an investigation about this and found that Jewish German soldiers in the German army served in a greater proportion than their proportion of the general male population, and were wounded and received medals in greater proportions than the average German soldier. So it was debunked, and the army never published that, the results of that investigation. In March 1917, he was sent back to the front just in time to defend against a deadly British offensive in Flanders. In October, he had 18 days leave, which he spent in several cities. I have that here. So he spent 5 months away from the front. He gets back to another horrific British offensive with many casualties in his company, and he goes on leave. And it's very interesting. He goes with his best friend Schmitt and 2 other of the dispatch runners. They first go to Brussels, then Cologne, then Leipzig, then Dresden, a real kind of little tourist tour, and end up in Berlin. So he travels with Schmitt. He's back at the front shortly thereafter. and again, with a lot of major fighting. At this time, once he was in Berlin, he was there alone. He stayed with the parents of one of the other dispatch bearers. Schmitt and the others weren't with him. He loved it there, as several postcards that he wrote back to his buddies at the front attest, and a well-thumbed Baedeker tourist guide to Berlin attest that Timothy Ryback found in the Library of Congress. In July 1918, after another major but unsuccessful battle, an officer in the regimental staff nominated him for an Iron Cross First Class, which he received. That officer was Hugo Gutmann, who happened to be Jewish. The aforementioned book by Thomas Weber sheds light on this event. After completing his manuscript about Hitler and the List Regiment, he was contacted by Gutmann's sister's granddaughter. And so again, we got this indirect source of evidence. This gave him access to a few documents and to some Gutmann family lore. Gutmann had been imprisoned and interrogated by the Gestapo in Nuremberg in 1937 about this second Iron Cross First Class. Gutmann was well treated in prison by one of his fellow List Regiment veterans, and a third, Fritz Wiedemann, who had been the supervisor of the regiment's dispatch runners, and thus of Hitler too, probably helped get Hitler's ear and get Gutmann released from prison. Wiedemann's story is also an interesting one because he became Hitler's personal adjutant in the early 1930s. So Hitler's former superior is now working basically as a secretary and jack of all trades for Hitler in the early 30s. He gets appointed to various, by the end of the 1930s, he became increasingly critical of Hitler's bellicose policies. He was relegated to the diplomatic post of German ambassador in San Francisco. During the war, he remained there and cooperated with US authorities against Hitler. In any case, there was nothing exceptional about Hitler being awarded the medal. Gutmann had no dirt to spill. He escaped by the skin of his teeth in 1940. After his train from Brussels to Paris was bombed by the invading Germans, he ended up in an internment camp on the Spanish border with his grown son and son-in-law. The three were able to escape and embark from Lisbon to the US, where they settled in St. Louis. So what does this tell us about Hitler's biography? Jewish German Gutmann was well liked by the List Regiment men, presumably also by Hitler, during and after World War I. Gutmann had served in the reactionary Free Corps after the war, so he's not some kind of socialist Jewish progressive. He was targeted in the 1930s because his existence was a potential embarrassment to Hitler. But he was shielded by regimental comrades who were working for Hitler's Nazi party. He is prime evidence that Hitler did not passionately hate all Jews during World War I. What prejudices Hitler may have harbored, he did not let them show, and was quite proud of his medal. He wore it often. The reason he went after Gutmann so much was that by this time, German school books were publishing stories about how he had earned that medal, and they sort of got more and more embellished. And at one point, one of the textbooks said he single-handedly captured, I think it was 9 French soldiers by bluffing them. They were in a dugout, and he said, you know, we've got you surrounded, come out with your hands up, and they did, you know, throw out your weapons, come out with your hands up. They did, and it was only him. So he was, you know, supposedly did this, but that's not what it was at all. In fact, in Weber's examination, it was really the dispatch bearers were disproportionately awarded medals because the officers knew them personally and were very thankful for the services that they performed. So while Hitler was undoubtedly brave. Okay, back to the battlefield. Finally, in October 1918, Hitler's vision was affected by a gas attack, and after convalescence in Brussels, he was sent to a military psychiatric hospital in Pasewalk, near the Polish border. Now this is where things get a bit tricky. Who's heard the story that he was blinded by gas? How? Very few. Okay. This is part of the kind of Hitler lore and what these two recent books, which may or may not have truth to them, say. Actually, his exposure to mustard gas was not severe. His comrades all regained their sight and returned to the front within a few days. The victims of the gas attack were treated at a well-equipped hospital in Brussels, but Hitler was sent back to Germany because his hysterical reaction to the sight impairment might set off a chain reaction in the Brussels hospital that everyone was going to say, you know, I still can't see. In Pasewalk, Dr. Karl Kroner diagnosed him as psychopathological with hysterical symptoms and turned him over to psychiatrist Dr. Edmund Forster, a different, not Edward Bloch, but Edmund Forster, for treatment. Remember that these were pre-Freudian days, and PTSD was considered shell shock or malingering or such like. One can imagine that the drubbing the German army was taking a heavy toll on Hitler himself. Forster was a very highly regarded doctor, the son of a military doctor. He had practiced in the Nerven Clinic, in the psychological clinic in Berlin previously. He later became a senior professor at Greifswald University, and it is known that he used his treatment of Hitler as a case study in teaching his students about the uses of hypnosis to break hysterically induced physical symptoms. So let's look at the source for these two new books that I mentioned at the outset. In 1972, a March 1943 U.S. naval interrogation was declassified. It was found decades later by two historians. Another source was a German émigré's novel written in Paris in the 1930s featuring the case of A.H. in P. It is presumptively based on Forster's account of his treatment of Hitler, which Forster had used as a case study in his Greifswald lectures. According to Kroner, this novel, Forster used his hypnotism to start treating Hitler, to break Hitler's hysterically induced inability to see. As the revolution, the communist, or the Soviet-style revolution unfolded in mid-November 1918, Forster was suddenly ordered to Berlin. He had to break off his treatment of Hitler without his final hypnotic debriefing. Thus, he left Hitler with a feeling of omnipotence. I'm shortening a lot here, but I hope you get the gist, and this is where Hitler's megalomania starts to unfold according to these new things. So, does it sound hokey? Well, I think yes and no. Scads of psychobabble has been written about Hitler's psyche. The best known is Brandeis Professor Rudolf Binyon's 1976 book, Hitler Among the Germans. Binyon already used Kroner's story about the diagnosis of hysterical blindness, but he also wrote that Hitler had subconscious hatred of the doctor who treated his mother, since the doctor used medications that inflicted additional pain on her. This is, of course, pure bunk, as the detailed sources about Hitler and Dr. Edward Bloch show. The main evidence for the importance of the October 1918 diagnosis is Hitler's statement in Mein Kampf that he again lost his sight after hearing the news that the war was lost and that the Kaiser has abdicated, and that shortly thereafter he could see again and decided, I quote, to become a politician. Let me read you a bit from the passage in Mein Kampf in which Hitler describes the gas attack, his blindness, and his reaction to the end of the war. On a hill, so Mein Kampf. On a hill south of Warwick, in the evening of October 13th, we were subjected for several hours to heavy bombardment with gas bombs, which continued throughout the night with more or less intensity. About midnight, a number of us were put out of action, some forever. Towards morning, I also began to feel pain. It increased with every quarter of an hour, and about 7 o'clock my eyes were scorching as I staggered back and delivered the last dispatch I was destined to carry in the war. A few hours later, my eyes were glowing like coals, and all was darkness around me. I was sent into hospital at Pasewalk in Pomerania, and there it was that I had to hear of the revolution. During the last few days, I had begun to feel somewhat better. The burning pain in the eye sockets had become less severe. Gradually, I was able to distinguish the general outlines of my immediate surroundings, and it was permissible to hope that at least I would recover my sight sufficiently to be able to take up some profession later on. that I would ever again be able to draw or design was naturally out of the question. Thus, I was on the way to recovery when the frightful hour came. He then describes how a local pastor comes and informs them. And then a crucial passage. As for myself, I broke down completely when the old gentleman tried to resume his story by informing us that we must now end this long war, because the war was lost, he said, and we were at the mercy of the victor. The fatherland would have to bear heavy burdens in the future. We were to accept the terms of the armistice and trust to the magnanimity of our former enemies. It was impossible for me to stay and listen any longer. Darkness surrounded me again as I staggered and stumbled back to my ward and buried my aching head between blankets and pillows. He then describes the horror of the thought of a left-wing takeover and a lost war. I quote again, "The more I tried then to glean definite information of the terrible events that had happened, the more my head became afire with rage and shame. What was all the pain I suffered in my eyes compared with this tragedy? The following days were terrible to bear and the nights still worse. To depend on the mercy of the enemy was a precept which only fools or criminal liars could recommend. During those nights my hatred increased, hatred for the originators of this dastardly crime." However, Thomas Weber's careful retracing of Hitler's activities from November 1918 to September 1919 showed that this ran completely counter to both the medical etiology of his blindness and what he actually did when he went to Munich. Hitler basically goes to Munich. He can see perfectly well. The hypnotic treatment in November was broken off November 15th. His sight was completely restored, and he went back to Munich immediately, remained a drifter. He stayed in the army. In December of 1919, he took a position in Traunstein, near where the Berghof was in the Alps, guarding French and Soviet POWs, again with Ernst Schmitt, his fellow runner. They basically got food for sitting at the gate, and these guys weren't going to try to escape from there. He returns to Munich in February. During the time, there's a Jewish communist running the show in Munich who's assassinated. Kurt Eisner is assassinated in April of 1919. And Hitler starts working for Army counterintelligence. The Army isn't really sure what's going to happen. It's right before the Versailles Treaty terms come out, when the Army is, as you probably know, reduced greatly in size. So Meyer was in charge of decommissioning soldiers in Munich and basically debriefing them, making sure they didn't go away hating the Army. And Hitler had gained some notoriety as a good speaker. And so he put Hitler through a training course with some professors of history at Munich University, and they sort of taught him how to tell soldiers that communists are bad, to make it very brief. And Hitler then worked giving lectures to the soldiers before they were decommissioned and allowed to go home. He later told a fellow List Regiment soldier who asked him, he said, Hitler, Adolf, how did they respond? And Hitler said, the last thing they're interested in is me to tell them, the communists are bad. A lot of them, have left-wing leanings, and it doesn't seem to be very effective. So, at any rate, what sources do we have? In military files, they've turned up reports about the schoolings that he took, the lectures he attended. They mention in passing that he was a successful speaker in the brief reports about these events. We have testimony that, as I just mentioned, that Max Ammon, his List Regiment colleague, gave to U.S. interrogators after the war. The lectures wound down as the soldiers left Munich, and Meyer gave Hitler new assignments. He was then 30 years old. One was to monitor the meeting of an obscure party, the DAP, the German Workers' Party. And another was, at the first meeting on September 12th of 1919, the speaker was talking about Bavarian separatism, and Hitler said that's just broke his cover, said that's bunk. We need to be a strong nation. Bavaria has to unify. We need Austria in the mix too. And everybody cheered him, and that was his first successful statement about politics. So to the acclaim of his listeners. A week later, Hitler joined the party. Within 4 months, by February 1920, he became its leader and had drafted its program, the famous 22-point Nazi Party program that remained in force until 1945. In March of 1920, he resigned from the army. So he writes about this in a letter he pens in November of 1921 to the head of this Austrian DNSAP. And he says, this biographical letter that I mentioned early on, he says, "I was appointed as an educational officer to the 41st Regiment of Sharpshooters. I held conferences on the subject of the insanity of the bloody Soviet dictatorship, and I can joyfully claim that when those soldiers were demobilized as a result of the reduction in numbers of the Reichswehr, they formed the first group of my own followers." Complete bunk. In June 1919, I joined the German Workers' Party. It was September, as a number of forged documents later show. So he created documents in addition to the actual records we have of the September dating, but he wasn't interested in accurate history at this point. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, and I'm sort of approaching the end of this thing. Right after that meeting, Captain Meyer, gave him a letter that he had received, or the Army counterintelligence had received, asking, why should we be anti-Semitic? Why are Jews important, even? And this guy, Adolf Gemlich, was interested in starting an army support group, in a way. Meyer gave Hitler the letter to respond to, and we still have a carbon of that original letter. And Hitler writes, very short quotation here, "Anti-Semitism as a political movement should not and cannot be driven by emotions but by facts. The fact, however, is that first of all, Judentum is a race, not a religious community." He elaborated why Jews could not be Germans, but at best German Jews, and continued, "The Jew is a leech upon the peoples of the world, and from this follows the end goal of rational anti-Semitism must be, without any compromise, the removal of the Jews. Only a government of national will can be capable of both." So here, without any question, we have the program that he repeats endlessly in speeches during the 1920s and comes to implement in the 1930s. So by September of 1919, we have a solid document that talks about him becoming an anti-Semite. So there's no evidence until the summer of 1919 that it was anything more than a prejudice. And then after these schoolings, he emerges as a virulent exterminationist, we can almost say. Removal of Jews in this case is Entfernung, is the German word. Okay, I'm going to briefly run through. So this is Ernst Schmitt, his buddy from the dispatch bearers. So you see Adolf here, and this is Schmitt. This is a close-up. This is, I believe, 1917. This is in 1915. The two men, and this is a picture in 1938 when they were together. Schmitt held to Hitler. He never published anything, but he was captured by the U.S. Army after the war and interrogated, and there's a denazification file because, as he told the American interrogators, he stuck to Hitler. And that was one of the news sources that this guy, Lothar Machtan, found, was his denazification file. And just retracing backwards the closeness of Schmitt and Hitler, he has a lot of circumstantial evidence that these guys were really, really close. As was Hitler with his friend Kubizek, where they roomed very intimately from May to September of 1908, and with Rudolf Häusler, with whom he moved to Munich, and they again shared a room. No proof. Emil Maurice, the aforementioned chauffeur, might have, the Anna Marie Sigismund's book says it was probably a triangular relationship, and that Maurice was bisexual and had a relationship with Gelly that Hitler was furious about when he found out, and there was a falling out between the two men for a time. So there is I find very interesting evidence that Hitler was gay, but of course that was a death sentence in politics if you came out as homosexual. So Hitler was very careful to squash every rumor that did indeed circulate in this period. So the meeting and the letter. So I've gone through, and 1923 he tries to take over the government. In 1924 he's put on trial. He's sentenced. The trial runs from February to April. He's sentenced to 5 years, but released before Christmas, and that's when he dictates Mein Kampf. He keeps on working on it, and then there's actually a third volume that we call Hitler's Secret Book that was never published. Not very interesting, all very difficult to plow through. In 1928, so he's released under the condition that he not get involved in politics. By 1927, 28, basically it's no longer enforced. The Nazi Party has been refounded with Hitler in the background. The party itself has its first major jump into the 20% as a party, sort of like the Tea Party just jumping onto the political stage. Very interesting thing happens in 1930. 2 Reichswehr soldiers are put on trial for advocating the overthrow of the government, and they're Nazi Party members, and Hitler is called as a witness. And there are statements by Hitler about the violent overthrow of the government. Oops, well, that wasn't the laser pointer. Prosecutor Hans Litten interrogates him for 3 hours, shows all of the contradictions, among other things that he was a draft evader in 1914. Hitler wins that argument and the trial by saying, I wasn't a draft evader, I reported to the draft board and got a deferment. So by just very clever maneuvers, and then he swears an oath of loyalty to and nonviolence about the party, that leads to some problems, some inter-party problems that he had. The so-called Stinnes Revolt. Stinnes was one of the top leaders of the SA Brown Shirts, and he wanted to fight. He wanted to brawl, and Hitler wouldn't let him. He took over the Nazi Party offices in Berlin, and took over the newspaper, published a newspaper editorial, and Hitler had his revolt brutally crushed. Reinstituted Ernst Schmitt, the leader of the SA, if you've heard of the Night of Long Knives, as head of the SA. Röhm was an uncloseted homosexual. In the late 20s, letters to some of his boyfriends were published, and it was widely known he had to flee to Bolivia for a while till things calmed down. So he was openly gay. Hitler hired him and used him to run the SA during this period. So it's another, and Röhm had been Hitler's patron in referring him to Captain Meyer in 1919. So a very crucial figure in Hitler's life. He then, in 1928, he becomes a German official in Brunswick, and becomes a German citizen finally, so he can actually run for office in Germany. He goes up against President Hindenburg in a election of multiple candidates, and then there's a runoff, just the two of them, which Hindenburg wins. And that's when journalists really get into trying to find people in Braunau. Who is this guy? We want to know. And a lot of the research and biographies come out. By January of 1933, he's appointed Chancellor by President Hindenburg. And in 1938 is the invasion of Austria. In April, there's a kind of sham election in Germany as well. The Austrians get to vote to join Germany. And Schmitt campaigns for Hitler in his region of Bavaria very, very loyally. So Schmitt and Hitler are clearly very, very close. So I'm going to give you just a few slides on Hitler's ancestry. This is a book published in 1938 as a tafel of a plaque of ancestry to prove that Hitler is the most recent generation, goes back to Roman numeral 12. So going back 12 generations, he's showing his Aryan ancestry. And this was very crucial. Another image, this came out during the presidential campaign. The headline reads, "Does Hitler have Mongolian blood. So here's a guy who talks about blood incessantly and racial purity and stuff like that, and in the physiognomy of non-Aryan peoples. And someone had written into the paper about a picture that this guy Gerlich had published earlier, and Hitler said, Hitler kind of resembles this guy. So he did a photo montage. It's a very satirical piece, comparing profiles and Hitler's broad nose and how un-Aryan Hitler was. This made Gerlich, of course, a prime target of Hitler, and he was indeed put in Dachau and killed 2 years later. But this comes out.